It is years since the incidents I am about to describe took place, and even now I find myself hesitant to set them down. For a long time, no matter how much discretion I exercised, it would have been impossible to make these facts public. But the principal figure in this account is now beyond the reach of any human law, and I believe the story can finally be told, with certain details suppressed, in a manner that will injure no one still living. I ask the reader's indulgence if I conceal the exact date or any detail that might allow the actual occurrence to be traced. It remains, in all my years beside Sherlock Holmes, an entirely singular experience, and I have never been more certain of anything than I am that it needed telling eventually. We had spent the evening on one of our customary rambles and returned to Baker Street around 6 o'clock, on a bitter, frost-hardened winter night. As Holmes turned up the lamp, its light fell across a calling card lying on the table. He glanced at it, made a short sound of disgust, and threw it to the floor. I picked it up and read the name printed there. Charles Augustus Milverton, Appledore Towers, Hampstead. Beneath it, a single word, agent. I asked who he was. The worst man in London, Holmes said, settling into his chair and stretching his legs toward the fire. He asked if there was anything written on the back. I turned it over and found a short note in pencil, saying the man would call at 6:30, signed with his initials. "He's about due," Holmes said. "Do you know that feeling, Watson, when you stand before the serpent enclosure at the zoo and something slithering and flat-eyed presses itself against the glass, and every instinct in you wants to step back? That is precisely what this man does to me. I have dealt with 50 murderers over the course of my career, and not one of them left me with the revulsion this creature manages simply by existing. And yet, I cannot avoid doing business with him. In fact, he is coming here at my own invitation." I asked again who exactly he was. Holmes said he was the king of every blackmailer in England. He said heaven help any man, and far more, any woman, whose secret came into Milverton's possession. With a smiling face and a heart of stone, he explained, Milverton would squeeze a person until there was nothing left to take. He was, in his own repulsive way, a genius, and might have made something respectable of himself in a cleaner trade. His method was simple. He let it be known he would pay very well for letters that compromised the wealthy or the well-placed, and he bought these letters, not only from disloyal servants, but from the sort of charming, well-mannered predators who make it their business to earn a trusting woman's affection first. He was not stingy about it either. Holmes told me he knew for a fact that Milverton had once paid £700 for a 2-line note, and that the note alone had been enough to bring down an entire noble family. Everything that could be bought found its way to Milverton eventually, Holmes said, and there were hundreds of people across the city who went pale at the sound of his name. No one knew where his hand might fall next, because he was far too wealthy and far too patient to need quick money. He would sit on a piece of leverage for years, waiting for the exact moment it could do the most damage, and only then would he play it. "I have called him the worst man in London," Holmes said, "and I want you to understand precisely why. Compare him, if you like, to some brute who beats a companion to death in a fit of drunken rage. Which is worse, the man who kills in a single moment of blind fury, or the one who sits at his leisure, methodically, calmly, torturing a person's spirit and wringing out their nerves purely to fatten an already swollen fortune?" I had rarely heard Holmes speak with such raw feeling. "Surely," I said, "the man must fall within the reach of the law somehow." "Technically," Holmes admitted, "perhaps, but not in any way that mattered practically. What good would it do a ruined woman to see him serve a few months in prison if her own reputation was destroyed the very moment his secret reached daylight? His victims could never strike back without destroying themselves in the process. If he ever made the mistake of blackmailing someone entirely innocent, we would have him. But he was too cunning for that. We would need another way to bring him down. I asked why he was coming here at all. Holmes said an important client had brought her case to him. The lady Eva Brackwell, one of the most celebrated debutantes of the previous season, was to be married within a fortnight to the Earl of Dorcourt. Milverton had gotten hold of several letters. Imprudent, Holmes stressed. Nothing worse than imprudent. That she had once written to an impoverished young man in the country. Those letters alone were enough to end the engagement entirely. Milverton intended to send them to the Earl unless he was paid a considerable sum, and Holmes had been engaged to meet with him and negotiate the best terms he could manage. At that very moment, a carriage rattled to a stop in the street below. I looked down and saw a handsome pair of horses, brilliant carriage lamps gleaming against their coats. A footman opened the door, and a short, stout man in a heavy fur-trimmed overcoat stepped down. A minute later he was shown into our rooms. Charles Augustus Milverton was a man of about 50, with a large head that suggested real intelligence. A round, plump, hairless face fixed permanently in an expression of benevolent good humor, and two sharp grey eyes that gleamed out from behind broad, gold-rimmed spectacles. There was something almost Pickwickian in his appearance, an impression spoiled entirely by the insincerity behind that frozen smile, and by the hard, restless glitter of his eyes, which never seemed to stop moving. His voice was as smooth and agreeable as his face, and he crossed toward us with one plump hand extended, murmuring some pleasant regret at having missed us during an earlier call. Holmes ignored the hand completely and regarded him with an expression I can only describe as granite. Milverton's smile only widened. He shrugged, removed his coat, folded it with deliberate care over the back of a chair, and sat down. He glanced at me and asked, with a small wave in my direction, whether it was discreet for third party to be present, whether it was, in his word, right. Holmes told him I was his friend and his partner. Milverton said that was very good, that he had only raised the point out of concern for his client's interests, given how delicate the matter was. Holmes said I already knew everything relevant. Then we may proceed to business, Milverton said. He asked whether Holmes had been authorized to accept his terms on Lady Eva's behalf. What are your terms? Holmes asked. £7,000. And the alternative? My dear sir, Milverton said, it pains me even to discuss it, but if the money isn't in my hands by the 14th, there will simply be no wedding on the 18th. His smile, if anything, grew more pleased with itself as he said it. Holmes said it was impossible. Milverton made a show of sorrowful surprise, drawing out a thick pocketbook. He said he found it such a pity that ladies were so ill-advised as to hesitate over these little matters. He held up a small note bearing a coat of arms and said it belonged to a lady whose name he would keep to himself, at least until the following morning, at which point it would be in her husband's hands instead. All because she wouldn't part with a comparatively small sum she could easily have raised by selling a few pieces of jewelry. Such a pity, he said again. He reminded Holmes, almost cheerfully, of the sudden collapse of an engagement between a Miss Miles and a Colonel Dorking 2 years before, over a sum that amounted to little more than £1,200. He said he found it remarkable that a man of Holmes's evident good sense would haggle over terms when a woman's entire future hung in the balance. Holmes considered this for a moment. He said Milverton seemed to be taking a great deal for granted, that he was of course entirely familiar with the contents of the letters, and that his client would follow whatever advice he gave her. His advice, he said, would be to tell her future husband the whole truth herself, and trust to his generosity. Milverton laughed at that. He said Holmes evidently didn't know the Earl, and from the flicker of frustration that crossed my friend's face, it was clear to me that he did know him and knew Milverton was right. Holmes asked what harm, precisely, the letters actually contained. Sprightly, Milverton said. Very sprightly. He said Lady Eva had been a charming correspondent, but that the Earl of Dovercourt would not appreciate the sprightliness in question. He said that if Holmes genuinely believed exposure would serve his client's interests, that was of course Holmes's decision to make, and he would simply proceed on that understanding. He rose and reached for his coat. Holmes, grey now, with barely contained anger, told him to wait, that they were moving too quickly, that they would certainly wish to avoid a scandal in so delicate a matter. Milverton settled back into his chair with evident satisfaction, murmuring that he'd felt certain Holmes would see reason. Holmes said that Lady Eva was not a wealthy woman, that even £2,000 would strain her resources badly, and that the figure Milverton had named was simply beyond any possibility. He asked that Milverton moderate his demand and accept the highest sum that could realistically be raised. Milverton acknowledged that what Holmes said about the lady's resources was probably true, but he pointed out that a wedding was exactly the occasion when friends and family typically made some special effort when they might otherwise be uncertain what gift to give. He suggested, with an unmistakable relish, that this small bundle of letters would bring the lady considerably more joy than any amount of silver candelabra. Holmes told him plainly that the money could not be found, and asked whether it wasn't wiser to accept a substantial sum now rather than destroy a young woman's future for no real gain. There, Milverton said, you are mistaken. An exposure would benefit him indirectly, and considerably. He mentioned almost idly, 8 or 10 similar matters currently maturing. If word got around that he had made a severe example of Lady Eva, every one of those other cases would suddenly become far more reasonable to deal with. Holmes came up out of his chair so quickly it startled me. Get behind him, Watson, he said. Don't let him out. Now, sir, let us see what's actually in that notebook of yours. Milverton moved with a speed I would never have credited to a man of his build, gliding sideways to the wall like something aquatic, his back against it. Mr. Holmes, he said, turning back the front of his coat to reveal the butt of a large revolver in an inside pocket. I had rather expected you to try something original eventually. This particular approach has been attempted so many times, and to so little effect. I assure you I am thoroughly armed and entirely prepared to use what I'm carrying, knowing full well the law would stand behind me if I did. Besides, he added, with something close to genuine amusement, you're mistaken if you imagined I'd be foolish enough to carry the actual letters here in a notebook. And now, gentlemen, I have 1 or 2 further calls to make this evening, and it's a long drive back to Hampstead. He stepped forward, retrieved his coat, kept one hand resting near the revolver, and turned toward the door. I picked up a chair without quite thinking about it, but Holmes shook his head, and I set it back down. With a small bow, that same insufferable smile, and a final twinkle of amusement, Milverton let himself out. A few moments later we heard his carriage door slam, and the wheels rattle away into the night. Holmes sat without moving for a long while after that, hands buried deep in his pockets, chin sunk on his chest, eyes fixed on the coals and grate. For half an hour he neither spoke nor stirred. Then, with the sudden decisive movement of a man who has finally made up his mind about something, he came up out of his chair and disappeared into his bedroom. A little later, a rakish young workman with goatee beard and a swagger to his walk lit a clay pipe at our lamp and went down into the street. "I'll be back at some point, Watson," was all he said. I understood, watching him go, that his campaign against Charles Augustus Milverton had begun. I did not begin to imagine the shape that campaign was about to take. For several days after that, Holmes came and went at all hours dressed as the same idle young workman, and beyond the occasional remark that his time was being spent out at Hampstead, and that none of it was wasted, he told me nothing of what he was actually doing. I had long since learned not to press him during these periods. He worked at his own pace, in his own way, and questions only slowed him down. Then, on a wild, howling evening, with the wind screaming against our windows and rattling the frames in their casements, he returned from what he told me was his final expedition. He removed the disguise, settled into his chair by the fire, and laughed to himself in that silent, private way he had when something had gone particularly well. "You would not," he said, "call me a marrying man, Watson." "No," I said. "Indeed I would not." "You'll be interested to hear, then, that I am engaged." "My dear fellow," I began, "I congratulate to Milverton's housemaid." "Good heavens, Holmes." "I wanted information," he said simply. "Surely," I said, "you have gone rather too far this time." "It was a necessary step," he said. "I am a plumber of some promise, by the name of Escott. I have walked out with her every evening for the better part of a week, and we have talked. Those conversations, Watson, I will spare you the details of. But I have gotten everything I needed from them. I know that house now as well as I know my own hand." "But the girl herself, Holmes," I said, "what becomes of her?" He shrugged, the gesture entirely unbothered. "You cannot help these things, my dear Watson. When the stakes on the table are what they are, you play the hand you dealt as best you can. I take some comfort, at least, in the knowledge that I have a rival for her affections who will certainly step in the moment my back is turned." He glanced toward the window, where the storm was still raging. "What a splendid night this is." "You like this weather?" I asked, somewhat astonished. "It suits my purposes admirably," he said. "Watson, I intend to burgle Milverton's house tonight." I felt something cold pass through me at those words, spoken so calmly, so deliberately, as though he were announcing nothing more dramatic than a change in dinner plans. In that instant I seemed to see, all at once, every possible consequence of what he was proposing. Discovery, arrest, a distinguished career ending in disgrace and ruin. My closest friend delivered, by his own hand, into the very power of the man he despised most in London. "For heaven's sake, Holmes," I said, "think carefully about what you're doing." He said he had thought about it with the greatest care, that he was never rash in his actions, and that he would never adopt a course this dangerous if any safer alternative existed. He asked me to consider the matter plainly and fairly. "Surely," he said, "I would agree that the action itself was morally justified, whatever its technical legal status. To break into Milverton's house was, after all, no different in principle from forcibly taking his notebook from him directly, an act I myself had been fully prepared to help him with only a few nights before." I turned it over in my mind. "Yes," I said eventually, "it's morally justified, so long as our only purpose is to recover material that has no business existing in the first place." "Exactly so," Holmes said. "And since the moral question is settled, the only remaining consideration is personal risk, and surely a gentleman ought not weigh that too heavily when a lady's entire future hangs in the balance. You'll be placing yourself in an impossible position if you're caught," I said. "That's part of the risk," he agreed. "There's no other way left to recover those letters. Eva has no money to raise and no one in her circle she can safely confide in. Tomorrow is the final day before Milverton acts on his threat, and unless we have those letters in hand tonight, he'll do exactly what he promised and ruin her. So either I abandon my client to her fate, or I play this last card available to me. Between the two of us, Watson, this has become something of a sporting contest, Milverton and myself. He had the better of our first exchange, as you saw. but my self-respect is engaged now, and I intend to see it through to the finish. I don't like it, I said. But I don't suppose that changes anything. When do we leave? He looked genuinely pleased at that, though he tried a moment to talk me out of coming, arguing that I had no real part to play. I told him plainly that if he didn't let me share the risk with him, I would take a cab straight to the nearest police station and turn him in myself, and that he knew perfectly well I had never broken my word in my life. He studied me for a moment, looking faintly annoyed, and then his expression cleared entirely, and he clapped me on the shoulder. Well, well, he said, so be it. We've shared a room together for years now, my dear fellow. It would only be fitting if we ended by sharing a cell as well. He crossed to a drawer and drew out a small leather case, opening it to reveal a set of gleaming instruments. This, he said, is a first-class, thoroughly modern burgling kit. Nickel-plated jemmy, a diamond-tipped glass cutter, adaptable keys, everything the discerning criminal requires. And here is my dark lantern. Do you happen to own a pair of silent shoes? I had rubber-soled tennis shoes, I told him. Excellent. And something for a mask? I said I could manage a couple out of black silk. You have, he said, a natural aptitude for this sort of work. Make the masks then. We'll have a cold supper before we go. It's 9:30 now. At 11, we'll take a cab as far as Church Row, and it's a quarter-hour's walk from there to Appledore Towers. We should be at work well before midnight. Milverton retires punctually at 10:30 and sleeps like the dead. With any luck, we'll be back here by 2, with Lady Eva's letters in my pocket. We dressed in our evening clothes so as to pass for 2 theatre-goers on their way home, took a hansom from Oxford Street up to an address in Hampstead, paid off the driver, and walked the rest of the way along the edge of the heath with our coats buttoned to the chin against a wind that seemed to cut straight through us, but to us. It's delicate work, Holmes told me quietly as we walked. The letters are kept in a safe in his study, and the study opens directly into his bedroom. He's a heavy sleeper, though, one of those stout, comfortable men who take excellent care of themselves. Agatha, that's my fiancée, tells me it's practically a joke below stairs that nothing short of a house fire could wake him. He keeps a secretary who's devoted enough never to leave the study during the day, which is precisely why we're going at night instead. And there's a wretched dog that patrols the grounds, though Agatha's agreed to shut it away these last 2 evenings to give me a clear path. This is the house, he said eventually, gesturing to a large building set back in its own grounds. Through the gate and to the right, among the laurels, we can put our masks on here, I think. Not a single light showing in any window. Everything is working exactly as it should, with the black silk covering our faces, transforming us, I imagine, into 2 of the more disreputable-looking figures in London that night. We crept up toward the dark, silent house. A tiled veranda ran along one side of it, lined by several windows and a pair of doors. That's his bedroom, Holmes whispered, nodding toward one door. This other one opens directly into the study, which would suit us best, except it's bolted as well as locked, and forcing it would make too much noise. Come this way. There's a greenhouse that opens through into the drawing room. The greenhouse door was simply locked, and Holmes removed a small circle of glass and reached through to turn the key from the inside. A moment later, the door closed behind us, and we had, in the strict eyes of the law, become felons. The warm, thick air of the conservatory pressed close around us, heavy with the rich, almost suffocating scent of exotic plants. Holmes took my hand in the darkness and led me swiftly past banks of foliage that brushed against my face on either side. He had always possessed a remarkable, carefully cultivated ability to see in near total darkness, and he guided us without hesitation through one door, across a room where I could smell the recent smoke of a cigar, and through another, which he closed gently behind us. I put out a hand and felt coats hanging along a wall, and understood we had entered a passage. We moved along it, and Holmes eased open a door on the right. Something rushed at us out of the dark, and my heart leapt into my throat before I realized, almost laughing with relief, that it was only a cat. A fire burned low in the room beyond, and again the air held the smell of recently smoked tobacco. Holmes stepped inside on his toes, waited for me to follow, and closed the door with painstaking care behind us. We were in Milverton's study. A curtained archway on the far side led through to what I understood must be his bedroom. Holmes crossed to the safe first, a tall green cabinet standing in the corner between the bookcase and the wall, brass fittings catching what little firelight reached them. He studied it for a moment, then moved silently to the bedroom curtain and stood with his head tilted, listening. No sound came from within. It occurred to me, standing there, that it would be wise to secure our line of retreat, and I checked the outer door we had come through. To my genuine surprise, it was neither locked nor bolted. I touched Holmes's arm to draw his attention to it, and I saw him go still, as startled by the discovery as I was. For half an hour, Holmes worked at the safe with total, focused concentration, laying down one instrument, taking up another, each movement carrying the precise, economical confidence of a surgeon at work. I stood near the center door, watching the room's other exits, my plans for what to do if we were interrupted still frustratingly vague in my own mind. Finally, I heard a soft click. The heavy green door swung open, and inside, in the dim light, I caught a glimpse of dozens of paper packets, each one tied, sealed, and carefully labeled. Holmes drew one out, found the firelight too unreliable to read by, and reached for his dark lantern, since it would have been far too dangerous, with Milverton sleeping just beyond that curtain, to risk the electric light. Then, quite suddenly, he went rigid, listening. An instant later, he had swung the safe door shut again, gathered up his coat and tools, and pulled me down behind the heavy curtain at the bay window, his hand pressing hard on my shoulder to keep me still and silent. The mystery of that unlocked door explained itself within moments. Milverton, it seemed, had never gone to his bedroom at all. He had been sitting up in some smoking room in the far wing of the house, one whose windows we had never seen from outside, and he had simply misjudged, or we had simply misjudged, exactly when he would retire. Through the gap in the curtain, which I dared to part only slightly, I could see his broad, rounded back directly in front of us, close enough almost to reach out and touch. He had settled into the red leather chair by the fire, legs stretched out before him, a long black cigar tilted at an insolent angle from the corner of his mouth. He wore a claret-colored smoking jacket with a black velvet collar and held a lengthy legal document in one hand, which he read in an unhurried, contented fashion, sending occasional rings of smoke drifting upward as he turned the pages. There was nothing in his posture to suggest he intended to leave that chair any time soon. I felt Holmes's shoulder pressed against mine and understood he was watching the same scene through his own narrow gap in the curtain. Several times Milverton glanced toward his watch. Once he rose, then sat back down again with a small gesture of impatience. It had not yet occurred to me that a man might keep an appointment at such an hour, until a faint sound reached us from the veranda outside. Milverton set down his papers at once and went still in his chair. The sound came again, then a soft tap at the door. He rose and opened it. There was the gentle rustle of a woman's dress. I had let the curtain fall closed as his face turned toward us, but now I risked opening it again, just enough. He had returned to his seat, the cigar still at that same careless angle. Standing before him, caught fully in the glare of the electric light, was a tall, slender, dark-haired woman, a veil drawn across her face, A mantle pulled close around her chin. Her breath came fast and shallow, and I could see, even from that distance, that her whole frame was trembling with some powerful, barely contained emotion. "You're nearly half an hour late," Milverton said, without much warmth. She said nothing, only shook her head. "Well," he said, "if you couldn't, you couldn't. If the Countess is such a hard mistress to work for, here's your chance to even the score with her a little. Bless the girl, what are you shivering for? There now, pull yourself together. Let's get down to business." He drew a note from his desk drawer. "You tell me you have 5 letters that would compromise the Comtesse d'Albert. You want to sell. I want to buy. So far, so simple. It's only the price left to settle. I'll want to inspect the letters myself, of course, and if they're genuinely good specimens." He stopped. "Great heavens," he said. "Is it you?" Without a word, the woman lifted her veil and let the mantle fall from her chin. A dark, striking face was revealed. A curved nose, strong dark brows, hard glittering eyes, and a thin mouth set in a smile that held nothing of warmth in it whatsoever. "It is I," she said, "the woman whose life you destroyed." Milverton laughed, though I could hear something underneath the laugh that betrayed him, a thread of genuine fear. "You were so remarkably stubborn," he said. "Why did you push me to such lengths? I promise you I've never wished to hurt anyone unnecessarily, but every man has his trade, and what choice did I have? I set the price well within what you could have managed. You refused to pay it. Don't imagine you can bully me now," he added, rising to his feet. "I need only raise my voice and my whole household comes running, and you'll be arrested where you stand. But I'll make some allowance for your understandable anger. Leave the way you came, and I'll say nothing further about it." The woman stood with one hand buried in the folds of her dress, that same deadly fixed smile never leaving her lips. "You will ruin no more lives the way you ruined mine," she said. "You will wring no more hearts the way you wrung mine. I intend to rid the world of something poisonous." "So you send the letters to my husband," she continued, her voice rising now. "And he, the noblest man who ever lived, a man whose boots I was never fit to lace, he broke his heart over it and died. Do you remember that night I came to you through that very door, and I begged you, I pleaded for mercy, and you laughed in my face, exactly as you're trying to laugh now. Except your coward's mouth can't quite hold the laugh steady this time, can it? You never imagined you'd see me here again. But it was that night that taught me exactly how I could stand before you again, face to face, and utterly alone. Take that," she said, drawing a small, gleaming revolver from where her hand had been hidden. "And that, and that, and that." She emptied the chamber into him, barrel after barrel, the muzzle no more than 2 feet from his chest. He staggered back and pitched forward onto the table, coughing violently, his hands clawing among the scattered papers. He forced himself upright once more, took another shot, and went down onto the floor entirely. "You've done for me," he said, and then said nothing more at all. The woman looked down at him for a long moment, then ground her heel deliberately into his upturned face. She looked once more to be certain, but there was no further sound or movement from him. I heard the soft rustle of her dress, felt the sudden cold rush of night air as the door opened somewhere, and she was gone. There was nothing either of us could have done to save him, and as she had emptied that revolver into his shrinking body, I had very nearly sprung from behind the curtain regardless, until I felt Holmes's hand close, cold and immovable, around my wrist. I understood the whole of what that grip was telling me without a single word passing between us. This was not our affair. Justice, in whatever crude and terrible form, had caught up with a genuinely evil man, and we had our own purpose here that could not be abandoned now. The woman had barely fled the room when Holmes was already moving, swift and silent, toward the far door. He turned the key in its lock. In that same instant, we heard voices rising elsewhere in the house and the sound of running feet. The gunshots had woken the household entirely. With a coolness that still astonishes me to remember, Holmes crossed straight to the open safe, gathered both arms full of the letter bundles, and fed them into the fire again and again until the safe stood entirely empty. Someone was already turning the handle of the locked door and beating against it from outside. Holmes looked swiftly around the room. The single letter that had drawn Milverton to his death lay on the table, spattered now with his blood. Holmes snatched it up and threw it into the blazing fire along with everything else. Then he pulled the key from the outer door, drew me through after him, and locked it again from the outside. "This way, Watson," he said. "We can clear the garden wall from here." I could not have believed an alarm would spread through a house so quickly. Looking back as we ran, the entire building blazed with light. The front door stood wide open, and figures were already pouring down the drive toward us. The whole garden seemed suddenly alive with people, and one man let out a great shout as we broke from the veranda. Following close on our heels, Holmes seemed to know every inch of that ground, threading a path through a stand of young trees with me right behind him, and our nearest pursuer gaining with every stride. A 6-foot wall finally blocked our way. Holmes went over it in a single motion. As I followed, I felt a hand close around my ankle from behind, kicked myself free, and came down hard among some bushes on the far side, glass from the wall's coping cutting at my palms. Holmes had me back on my feet before I'd fully landed, and together we sprinted out across the vast, dark expanse of Hampstead Heath. We must have covered 2 miles before Holmes finally slowed and stood listening. There was nothing behind us. Complete silence. We had lost them, and we were safe. We breakfasted the following morning and were smoking our first pipes of the day, still turning over the remarkable events of the night before, when Lestrade of Scotland Yard was shown into our sitting room, wearing his most solemn and self-important expression. "Good morning, Mr. Holmes," he said. "I wonder if you are terribly occupied at present." "Never too occupied to hear you out," Holmes said. "I thought," Lestrade said, "that if you had nothing pressing on hand, you might be interested in assisting us with a rather remarkable case from last night, out at Hampstead." "Dear me," Holmes said, with an admirable show of mild curiosity. "What happened?" "A murder," Lestrade said. "A genuinely dramatic one. I know how you enjoy this sort of thing, and I'd take it as a real favor if you'd come out to Appledore Towers and give us your opinion. It's no ordinary crime. We've had our eye on this Milverton fellow for some time, and between the two of us, he was a thorough villain, known to hold papers he used for blackmail. Every one of them's been burned by whoever did it. Nothing of value taken at all, which suggests to me the men responsible were of decent standing themselves and only wanted to prevent some scandal coming out." "Criminals," Holmes repeated. "Plural." "Yes, 2 of them," Lestrade confirmed. "We very nearly took them red-handed. We've got their footprints, we've got a description. It's 10 to 1 we run them down eventually. The first man moved too quickly for anyone to get a proper look, but the second was caught by the undergardener and only broke free after a struggle. Middle height, powerfully built, square jaw, thick neck, mustache, a mask over his eyes." "That's rather vague," Holmes observed. "It could just as easily describe Watson here." "It's true," Lestrade said, laughing outright at the idea. "It could add that. I'm afraid I can't be of any help to you on this one, Lestrade," Holmes said. "The truth is, I knew this man Milverton myself. I considered him one of the most dangerous individuals in London, and I hold to the belief that there exist certain crimes the law simply cannot reach, and which, to some real degree, justify a person taking the matter into their own hands. No, it's no use arguing the point with me. My mind is settled. My sympathies lie entirely with whoever did this, rather than with the man who died, and I will not touch this case." Holmes said not one further word to me about what we had witnessed that night, though I noticed all through the morning that he wore his most thoughtful expression, his eyes distant, his manner distracted, like a man straining to recall something just at the edge of memory. We were partway through lunch when he suddenly sprang up from the table entirely. "By Jove, Watson," he said, "I have it. Get your hat. Come with me." He set off at a near run down Baker Street and along Oxford Street, all the way to the edge of Regent Circus, where he stopped before a shop window filled with photographs of the era's notable figures and beauties, his eyes fixed on one photograph in particular, and following his gaze, I found myself looking at the image of a stately, regal woman in full court dress, a high diamond tiara set upon her head. I studied that delicately curved nose, those same strong, marked eyebrows, that same straight mouth, and the firm set of the small chin beneath it. My breath caught as I read the name beneath the photograph, the long-held title of a great statesman and nobleman, and understood whose wife she had been. My eyes met Holmes's. He raised one finger to his lips, and without another word between us, we turned and walked away from the window together.